Hello, people out there on YouTube. I am tired. I am Eric, and I am from Dead Tech, and this is the now seventh installment of the Reader Question Roundup, wherein you asked me a bunch of questions through Twitter and YouTube and my blog and all sorts of places, and I, in a pretty predictable turn of events, I answer those questions. So today, I am answering 4 more questions. That is the magic number we've kind of settled on here. Those questions are going to be number 1, advice for submitting stuff on Upwork. Number 2, how these efficiencer firms that I talk about, which are sort of like if software developers banded together and formed law firm-esque ways of working, how would those scale up? Is it fair to take a big cut for negotiating and planning the work is the third question. And the fourth is, how did I go from programmer to management and strategy consultant? So if you would like to see and hear the answer to those 4 questions, please stay tuned. All right, so this first one is my advice for submitting stuff on Upwork. And I want to make a quick procedural note here. More and more, in order to do more of this content and bring you these things more efficiently, I'm not really even more than glancing at these things in advance when people ask them. So for what it's worth, this is like pretty off the cuff improvisational stuff. If you catch me therefore in something contradictory or silly, I apologize in advance. Oh, no, actually I don't apologize that much in advance. I'm just kind of answering questions as if we were here in conversation, not memorizing everything I've ever done. So caveat emptor. And with that being said, my advice for submitting stuff on Upwork. So somebody asked key points you can give me in submitting a resume / cover letters. My Upwork proposals haven't gotten any recognition. Key points. That actually sounds more like an order than a question.
That's an order! Understand?
But, you know, I'll treat it as a question. Like, what key points can you give me in submitting a resume and cover letter? So I don't know if Upwork requires resumes and cover letters, but, you know, it doesn't actually matter. My advice for how best to submit resumes and cover letters on Upwork would be to go to upwork.com and then don't do anything and close the browser and rethink how you're looking for business. I hate to be snarky like that, but I just wouldn't recommend to anyone who's a freelancer to go onto sites like that as more than kind of an emergency measure. I don't think it's a solid business strategy. I think that what will happen is if that's how you acquire your business, you're going to eventually burn out because you are commodifying your own skill set. So when you go to a site like that, whether it's Upwork or I think you can do stuff like this on Stack Overflow, you're basically approaching the freelance world in the same way that employees approach the employed world, which is I've got this laundry list of acronyms and skills and frameworks and programming languages, and I'm looking for someone to come along and figure out how that can be useful to someone. And when that happens, that means that you're competing as an application development generalist against the other 19,999,999 programmers in the world for similar generalist positions. And that creates a pretty effective race to the bottom where they're just going to look for whoever kind of does the most all-right-ish job for the cheapest. And so when you put yourself on these sites like Upwork or TopToller or whatever they are, and you get into that commodity game, then basically you're going to always be trying to write these proposals where you're dealing with people who want to find the cheapest possible resource, and you're trying to convince them, oh no, don't go with the cheapest. I'm good at these things. Like I do XML good and React and stuff. So because I'm better at that than other people, you should be willing to pay my hourly rate at which I can afford my apartment. And that isn't the greatest sales tactic, and that will be your life. So what I would say is instead of, if you want to put stuff on there and get responses, my answer to this is reduce your rate to like nothing and you'll get responses because that's what people want. But if you're not getting responses, you're probably charging too much for those platforms. And my advice isn't charge less. It's go somewhere where there isn't competition. So go out to people who aren't looking on Upwork and like look for problems that you can solve for them and start building a business that has a niche. I talk about this a lot on the YouTube channel, on my blog, etc. So you can check that out for more information. You will see plenty of things about specializing, niching, and finding a good way to do business that isn't commodity work. So that's question 1. Moving on now to question 2, how do efficiencer firms scale up? Now, if you check out my last video, I explained a bit about the efficiencer. This is basically just the idea to summarize that I wrote a book called Developer Hegemony, and in that I talked about this model of software development where instead of us being managed, we should go off and band together into firms to do technologist application development type stuff, the way that like law firms or doctor practices operate, where the principals involved call the shots and you delegate things like project management and finance and all that to subordinates, rather than being sort of the lowest rung of the organization the way developers are and having project and product and whatever managers over you, where you're sort of the least important person in the whole thing.
Look down, don't look in the eye. Look down, you're here.
So this question is, if we're building these efficiencer firms, these sort of law firm-like software developer entities, how do they scale up? And it's a very long question that I'm not going to read all of, but his point is basically, in order to scale up, wouldn't you have to start taking on employees? I expressed sort of a preference in the book that these firms not really take on employees and just partner with each other and have sort of egalitarian mindset. So he's asking, yeah, but how do you scale? You'd get to a certain point where you'd kind of need to start bringing in like junior partners and then maybe employees as you got bigger and bigger. This is a kind of conceptually difficult thing to unpack here, but I'm going to ask you to bear with me. The way that you would scale up, number one, without kind of compromising these values is you might not. You might just say there's 5 of us, and so we only take on whatever work 5 people can do, and we earn a living at that, and that's fine. We just don't scale up. We don't need to. Like, not everything needs to grow like a cancer in society. So you could, I think, kind of Basecamp operates according to this model where they don't scale up all that much, and they just have a very what's the word I'm looking for? Like a very deliberate focus on how big they want to be, and they want to preserve the business and the way it works without just kind of sacrificing everything at the altar of scale. So that's one option. But the other option, if you're like me and you wouldn't just kind of want to preserve status quo indefinitely, is to think about scale differently. And here's the problem, I think, with how you, dear reader, and a lot of people think about scale in the custom software world. The custom software world being the main source of this problem, is everything is a custom project, and that means that we're always reasoning in terms of developer labor, which means hourly stuff. So stay with me here, but if you have like 4 partners working together and they kind of do one project after another, and then a client comes along and says, hey, I really like what you 4 are doing, but I need a bigger bucket of stuff done, the kind of stuff that would take 8 of you to do. The question might then become like, how would you say no to this, or how would you handle this? And so we tend to think of scale only in units of human labor that grow. And so what happens here is you could say, all right, we'll become a partnership of 8 or 12. But at some point, that starts to become less and less pragmatic. And so you need to bring more and more kind of overhead and managerial stuff in. The finances get more complex. You're sending out more invoices. Maybe you need a dedicated project manager to do status updates and project managery things. And so somehow you have to pay for this. And maybe you contract out that work, or maybe you get more economical and you bring that person on as an employee. And so there's this idea here that the way you scale is you build out more and more humans laboring by the hour. And what you have to start doing is paying out less than you charge, which is a margin. So as you grow, the only way to grow is to earn margin on top of the labor of others. And that margin tends to be thin unless you push their wages way down. So how do you push their wages way down? Well, you hire junior people, or you hire inexperienced people, or you offshore it. And you start to get to this point where to get your company bigger and bigger, those margins need to go from 10% to 20, and then eventually at the biggest app dev body shop type places, you probably see like 70% margins in these global places where, you know, they're paying the developers $65K a year and they're billing them out at $170 an hour. And if you do the math there, that's quite an incredible margin. Don't scale that way. Just don't think that way. Here are other ways that you could scale that don't involve human labor and earning a margin off of the top of it. Number one, you could build a product or a productized service even. So if you have your efficiencer firm that's doing some kind of custom labor, or forget the efficiencer firm, let's talk maybe about my, there's like a raccoon outside or something. Let's talk about my code-based assessment practice. If I wanted to scale that, so what I historically do, I mean, now I just run hit subscribe for the most part, but I used to go out and kind of answer custom questions using a data-driven assessment of a code base, and I would do this for C-level executives. This was a pretty lucrative practice. You know, it was pretty easy to command 10K a week doing this sort of thing. If I wanted to scale that up, I could do things other than teaching a bunch of aspiring Erics how to do it, and then charging $10,000 a week while paying them $2,000 a week. There's much better ways to scale this up than to do that. One of them would be I could teach these folks how to do this and run sort of a boot camp with a few cohorts a year and say, look, this is my model. You can have access to the internal source code I've developed. I will teach you all how to go out and do this on your own, you know, for whatever, $2,000 a seat. That would be another model, a way I could scale up the business that wasn't just doing more labor or earning margin off of other people doing my labor. I could just build an info product or a robo analyzer that I put up online, and that would scale pretty well because I'd put that up online, and whether there were 2 buyers or 20 or 200, I might have to deal with slightly more bugs, but it's not labor. I just put a thing up and that can scale as much as I want. So I'll wrap this question by saying that the way these firms should scale isn't by earning margin on more and more people's labor. They should figure out ways to take the expertise they're developing as they move from similar project to project and productizing some of that or operationalizing it and finding other revenue streams that they can develop that don't require just laboring. So that's my answer to how those can scale. All right, that was a longer one, so let's do a relatively shorter one. Actually, I might wind up with a lot to say on this, but anyway, question 3. The TLDR is I was consulting alone, and I'm not sure how to do it with a team. This is another long one, so what I'll say here is that it's from a reader who has developed a practice that he can, kind of like I was just talking about with the code-based assessments, price at like 50K or 100K. And he's saying that he's not the best developer in the world, but he's operationalized this thing, built out a network of contacts, gotten good at selling it, and he can sell it plugging in people where, you know, they would probably be relatively content doing the work for 10K. So selling it at 50 to 100K, that means he can earn a margin of 40 to 90,000. And so what he's asking is basically, should he feel guilty about that? Should he try to remain as a middleman? Because what happens if the client, who's getting 100K worth of value, finds out that somebody can deliver part or even, I guess, all of it for way, way cheaper? And in generally, am I an imposter or a pimp for doing this?
I'm gonna find this hoe.
Now, a lot of you watching this will probably think yes. And the reason that you'll think yes is because, circling back a little to question 1, the whole like Upwork conundrum, we have sort of, to our own detriment, become accustomed to thinking of app dev labor as the only thing that matters in the world of app dev. So we will actually, as newly minted freelancers, do something like this. Client comes along and says, hey, I need a Python website. And you say, all right, I'll bid on that. You know, I'll do that for $125 an hour. Here's what I'll do. I'll come in, you know, I'll do a 2-day meeting with you. We'll kind of lay out discovery and strategy, and we'll call it sprint 0. And after that, which is pre-sales to me, I'll just do that in order to win the business. With that out of the way, I'll start doing the real work of app dev labor. And then maybe I'll do some kind of follow-up retainerish thing where I fix bugs. What you miss when you do that is that there is an awful lot of value in your ability to get those contacts. So your ability to acquire business in the first place is long and hard won. I can't tell you how many questions I get from people that are like, how do I find business? There is a whole world of software developers out there that know all of the codes, but they have no idea how to find business. That's thing one. Thing two, all of that strategy, that discovery stuff, you should be charging way more for that type of thing than you should the labor. Because there are 20 million software developers out there that can do the labor, but there aren't nearly as many people that can sit down with a client for 2 days and figure out exactly what that client needs and why, and whether to do it or not, and whether it's going to yield an ROI for the client, and so on and so forth. So to come back, if you think of your work only in terms of the application development labor required, you're missing the overwhelming majority of the value and the cost. If you have a practice where you have built up a network over time, you've created a website, you've gone out and given talks and done marketing and built yourself up as an expert in the field, you've built this network of clients that will engage you for initial and repeat business, that will give you referrals. If you've built standard operating procedures around how to do a sales call, how to onboard a client, how to write a proposal, how to respond to their response to the proposal, and on and on and on, even into like how to do maintenance, you have built a business. And the cost of building a business is usually at a bare minimum well into the 5 figures, but it's probably well beyond that. And you have built this business probably on nights and weekends of incredible amounts of labor, battle scars, eating ramen while you were getting this thing off the ground. All that cost doesn't evaporate at the moment that you pluck some software developer off of Upwork and get them to do a thing for a client. You are carrying all of that cost and investment to everything you did. So for that person that you're employing for a fraction where you're claiming a lot of margin, yeah, that person with you already having created this business can plug in and do it. But if you just said to that person, look, I'm not sharing anything with you about this at all, so go and recreate my business model, it would take that person years. So for you to feel bad about taking a big cut, not at all. That business wouldn't exist without you. That client wouldn't have anyone to do the work. And if you want to really drive that point home, you could always, if you're worried about introducing the client and the laborer, you could say, hey, I'm not going to tell you, either one of you, anything about how this should go. You know, meet in the middle and negotiate whatever you want. And if that fails, when it fails, give me a call.
All I know is we don't want that.
So no, don't feel bad about that. Building a business is very expensive, whether in labor or startup capital or whatever. So you should, by all means, price things accordingly. All right, now we're on to question 4, and I will try to keep this relatively brief. This is an easy one to answer. How did you go from management or programmer to management and strategy consultant? And this is a short, sweet question that somebody who is a reader of my site asked of me. The answer is not that directly. I went actually from programmer to programmer or dev manager was the first step. I guess architect and tech lead thrown somewhere in the mix there. And then from there to CIO. And then I blasted out of the corporate world 5-6 years ago and went from being a CIO to doing developer training and coaching, kind of embedding with teams and taking some of those same kind of leadership skills. I thought of coaching as like being a department head, but with only the fun stuff where you're mentoring and not the stuff where you're listening to weird HR complaints. So I carried that forward. And then the more I did that, the more I was kind of in organizations talking to management about the care and feeding of development teams and how to structure org charts and how to make people happy. And so that kind of naturally transitioned into giving advice to IT leadership. And then from there, I sort of did less and less of the training and more of the advice, just in terms of the work I would agree to and the things I wanted to do. And that also dovetailed into my specialized management strategy consulting, like code-based assessment practice. So for me, it was a very evolutionary process over a bunch of years. It wouldn't need to be so for you. The main thing you would need to do to go from a programmer to doing strategy consulting is, in a nutshell, you would have to figure out something of value you could offer directly to an organizational decision maker in IT, like a CIO or something, and then start offering that thing as well as like strategy and advice around it. So it could be something like, you know, how to reduce your cost on AWS or whatever. But the main thing would be, number one, you've got to stop kind of thinking of programming labor as your main currency and start thinking of advice and ways that you can help buyers directly. Whereas programming labor, you kind of go through this whole network of people. It's a buyer committee. So the people with the money don't know or care enough about your detailed skill set to give you money.
You know what I'd settle for if it was up to me? Bart's medical bills and an apology.
And you won't even get that. Sorry, office
And the people who know or care about your skill set, architects, that type of person, don't actually have any organizational authority and they can't give you money. So what happens is, this is called a buyer committee in marketing. It means that at least 2 people, and usually more, come together to make a buying decision. And when you do that, it's a system, and that system looks a whole lot like a job interview. So you need to figure out a way to get around the buyer committee and go right to the person with money and appeal directly to that person. Once you do that, they will look to you for strategic advice around your area of expertise. So that's kind of in a nutshell how I would short circuit 5 meandering years, or, well, it probably only took me about 2. Well, I don't know. If you count me ascending into management, it could be back to 5. So anyway, if you don't want to spend 5 years at it, you can do it a lot more directly. Yeah, 4 questions. This one was a little longer, but oh well, c'est la vie. If you liked this, please give me a thumbs up. If you didn't like it, you can let me know that with a thumbs down. If you're enjoying these and want to see when future ones come out, I would love it if you would subscribe and then go hit that bell, which will tell you when the videos come out. However you want to engage or not, I would love it. Especially if you have questions that you'd like me to answer, throw those in the comments or on deadtech.com, my blog, or wherever. Happy to answer them. And I thank you, as always, for watching, and we'll catch you next time.